The smoking crater where Outpost Gamma 7 used to exist was, by all reasonable standards, not the sort of place one expected to find a human sitting cross-legged, humming what appeared to be a lullaby. Yet there Dr. Elizabeth Martinez sat, her singed lab coat draped over three small, furry forms that wheezed with each labored breath. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent the last 6 months treating space rabies and imported Earth ferrets, only to end up in the middle of what the news feeds were calling the most devastating military defeat in galactic history. The Zephyrian Empire's finest battlecruiser lay in twisted metal chunks around her, its crew presumably vaporized along with most of the outpost. She should probably be dead too. Instead, she was doing what came naturally, trying to keep 3 injured animals alive. "Easy there, little ones," she murmured to the cubs, adjusting her coat to better shield them from the falling ash. They looked like a cross between wolves and dragons, with scales instead of fur on their backs, and way too many teeth for anything that small. Their breathing was shallow, and the smaller one had what looked like a plasma burn along its side. The sound of approaching spacecraft engines made her look up. A massive Zephyrian dreadnought was descending, its hull gleaming despite the battle damage, probably coming to assess the carnage and count their dead. Elizabeth sighed. She really didn't have time for this. The cubs needed immediate medical attention, and she was fairly certain that explaining to alien military officials why the only survivor of their devastating defeat was a veterinarian with 3 unidentified alien babies was going to be a bureaucratic nightmare. The dreadnought landed with the subtle grace of a falling building, sending up clouds of ash and debris. A boarding ramp extended, and out marched what appeared to be the entire Zephyrian High Command, all 8 feet of them, resplendent in metals and looking like they'd been carved from granite and bad attitudes. The lead general, she could tell by the excessive number of shiny things on his uniform, approached with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested he was used to people cowering. His 4 eyes focused on her with obvious confusion. "You!" he boomed in that particular tone that military officers reserved for people they suspected of being problems. "Identify yourself." Elizabeth looked up from checking the smallest cub's pulse. "Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, Galactic Veterinary Service, and you're standing in my treatment area." The general's face cycled through several colors that probably indicated emotions she didn't have translation software for. Behind him, his officers were muttering among themselves in rapid Zephyrian, their voices reaching frequencies that made her teeth itch. "Treatment area?" The general's voice hit a pitch that suggested his vocal cords were having an existential crisis. "This is a battle site. Our most elite squadron was annihilated here by the Crimson Maw pack." Elizabeth blinked. "The what now?" "The most feared predators in this sector. Ancient, ruthless. They devour entire civilizations." He gestured dramatically at the destruction around them. "Our intelligence suggested they were using this outpost as a breeding ground." "Huh." Elizabeth looked down at the 3 cubs sleeping under her coat. One of them made a small chirping sound that was, admittedly, quite adorable. "Well, I haven't seen any ancient, ruthless predators. Just these 3 injured babies who were hiding in the rubble." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or explosions. The general stared at her, then at the cubs, then back at her. His officers had gone very still in that way that suggested they were either preparing to worship her or disintegrate her. "You." The general's voice was barely a whisper now. "You have captured 3 Crimson Maw juveniles." "Captured?" Elizabeth frowned. "I'm treating them. They're hurt and scared and need medical attention. And you sit here, undefended, in the aftermath of a battle that destroyed our finest warriors. Look, I appreciate the dramatic build-up, but could we maybe continue this conversation somewhere with actual medical facilities? Because this little one," she indicated the smallest cub, "has internal bleeding, and your ship probably has better surgical equipment than my field kit." The general took a step backward. Several of his officers made gestures that her cultural database unhelpfully informed her were either religious signs or preparation for combat. Possibly both. "You show no fear," the general said, and there was something approaching awe in his voice now. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. They're babies. Injured babies. Why would I be afraid? Because, the general said slowly, as if explaining quantum physics to a particularly dim houseplant, they are the offspring of creatures that just destroyed our most powerful military installation. And? The word hung in the air like a challenge. The general opened his mouth, closed it, and looked helplessly at his officers. One of them, a tall female with more scars than a street map, stepped forward. Permission to speak, General? Granted, Colonel. The colonel looked directly at Elizabeth with all four eyes, which was frankly unsettling. Are you claiming that you can control these creatures? Control? Elizabeth almost laughed. Have you ever tried to control a scared, injured animal? I'm just keeping them calm until I can get them proper treatment. The colonel and general exchanged a look that spoke volumes in a language Elizabeth wasn't fluent in, but she was pretty sure it translated to something like, "Oh, we are so incredibly screwed." Dr. Martinez, the general said with the careful tone of someone trying not to accidentally start a war, would you be willing to accompany us to our command vessel? Elizabeth looked down at the cubs, who were beginning to stir. The smallest one opened eyes that were frankly enormous, and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a whimper. Only if you've got a proper veterinary suite, she said. These little ones are going to need round-the-clock monitoring. As she stood up, carefully cradling the cubs in her coat, she missed the looks of absolute terror that passed between the Zephyrian officers. She also missed the colonel quietly activating her emergency communicator and sending a priority message to High Command that roughly translated to, "Have encountered human. She has domesticated the Crimson Maw. Request immediate backup, psychiatric evaluation, and possibly a priest." The Zephyrian command vessel, Elizabeth had to admit, had an impressive medical bay. She'd seen worse facilities on core worlds, though she could have done without the 27 medical officers, 15 xenobiologists, and what appeared to be the entire officer corps crowding around her workstation like she was performing surgery on the fabric of space-time itself. "Could everyone please take about 6 steps back?" she asked, not looking up from where she was running a bioscanner over the smallest cub. "You're making them nervous, and nervous animals don't heal well." The crowd shuffled backward with the coordination of a military unit, which, she supposed, they were. The general, who had introduced himself as General Thexmore, first of his name, destroyer of the Void Runners, protector of the 7 systems, and apparently a dozen other titles that made her wonder if Zephyrians were compensating for something, stood at what he probably thought was a respectful distance. "Dr. Martinez," he said with the careful tone of someone trying not to accidentally offend a deity, "our xenobiology experts are perplexed by your methods." Elizabeth glanced at the crowd of scientists, who were taking notes with the intensity of graduate students cramming for finals. "It's called veterinary medicine. I clean wounds, administer pain medication, provide nutrition, and ensure they get adequate rest. Pretty standard stuff." "You sing to them," observed one of the scientists, a tall, thin Zephyrian with more recording equipment than seemed strictly necessary. "They like it. Helps keep them calm." Elizabeth carefully applied a dermal regenerator to the plasma burn on the smallest cub's side. It chirped softly and nuzzled her hand. "See? Basic pain management through behavioral conditioning." The scientist nearly dropped his equipment. "Behavioral conditioning?" "Sure. You establish trust, provide comfort, and they associate your presence with safety and healing. Standard operating procedure for treating any stressed animal." Elizabeth missed the frantic note-taking this comment inspired, but she couldn't miss the collective intake of breath from the assembled officers. General Thexmore stepped forward, his expression cycling through what she was beginning to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of an existential crisis. "Doctor, are you saying that you can condition Crimson Maw behavior?" Elizabeth looked up from her patient. The cub had fallen asleep with its head pillowed on her arm, making small, contented sounds. "Well, yeah. Any social species can be conditioned through positive reinforcement. Though I'd hardly call this conditioning. It's more like basic trust building." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several recording devices hitting the deck as their operators forgot they were holding them. Trust, General Thexmore repeated slowly, as if testing the word for explosive potential. You have built trust with Crimson Maw juveniles. They're babies, Elizabeth said, a note of exasperation creeping into her voice. Of course they respond to kindness. What did you expect, psychological warfare? The general's expression suggested that was, in fact, exactly what he had expected. Dr. Velthara, the chief xenobiologist, stepped forward with the careful movements of someone approaching a live grenade. In your professional opinion, Dr. Martinez, could this trust building be scaled up? Scaled up how? To adult Crimson Maw specimens. Elizabeth considered this while gently repositioning the sleeping cubs. Well, socialization is easier when they're young, but adult animals can certainly learn to trust caretakers. It takes time, patience, and consistent positive interactions. Why? The look that passed between the Zephyrian officers was the kind of look that usually preceded either the outbreak of war or the discovery of a new element. Doctor, General Thexmore said, with the carefully controlled tone of someone trying to keep their voice from breaking, the adult Crimson Maw pack that destroyed our outpost. They're currently holding the Kepler mining colony hostage. Elizabeth frowned. Hostage? That doesn't sound like normal predator behavior. Are you sure they're not just protecting territory? They have surrounded the colony with their entire pack. 47 individuals. They've made no aggressive moves, but they won't allow anyone to leave. Huh. Elizabeth gently stroked the largest cub, who made a sound like a cross between a purr and a rumble. That sounds more like protective behavior than aggression. Are these their cubs? We believe so. And you took their babies to a military outpost because... The general's color cycled through several shades that probably indicated embarrassment. The outpost was studying them. For research purposes. Elizabeth's expression went flat. You stole their children. It was for the good of galactic science. You stole their children, and now you're surprised that the parents are upset. Elizabeth's tone had acquired the particular edge that veterinarians reserved for pet owners who came, in complaining that their cats were acting weird after they'd rearranged all the furniture and gotten a dog. We didn't steal, we were observing... General. Elizabeth's voice cut through his protests with surgical precision. I've been a veterinarian for 15 years. I've seen every kind of animal behavior you can imagine. And what you're describing isn't hostage-taking. It's a rescue operation. The general stared at her. His officers stared at her. Several of the scientists appeared to be having minor nervous breakdowns. A rescue operation, the general repeated. They're waiting for their children to come home. Probably hoping that whoever took them will realize their mistake and return them. Elizabeth looked down at the cubs who were sleeping peacefully in her arms. The question is, what are you going to do about it? General Thexmore opened his mouth, closed it, and looked desperately at his staff. Colonel Kethera stepped forward with the expression of someone who had just realized they were standing on a trapdoor. Dr. Martinez, she said carefully, would you be willing to facilitate a reunion? You want me to return these babies to their parents. We want you to negotiate with a pack of creatures that have never been successfully communicated with. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. Have you ever tried communicating with them, or did you just start shooting? The silence answered that question more effectively than words. Right. Elizabeth stood up, still cradling the cubs. Well, in that case, I suppose we'd better head to this colony and fix your mess. As she walked toward the door, the cubs chirping softly in her arms, she missed the desperate communications flying between the Zephyrian vessels. She also missed Colonel Kethara, quietly updating their status with high command. Human has agreed to negotiate with Crimson Maw Pack. She refers to operation as fixing our mess. Request immediate backup from Xenopsychology Division, Diplomatic Corps, and possibly the Department of Miracles. The Kepler mining colony looked like someone had built it specifically to offend any aesthetic sense that evolution might have developed. Industrial gray blocks arranged with all the architectural grace of a child's first attempt at building with blocks, surrounded by mining equipment that appeared to be held together by spite and bad decisions. Currently, it was also surrounded by 47 of the most terrifying predators Elizabeth had ever seen outside of Earth's fossil record. The adult Crimson Maw were impressive in the way that natural disasters were impressive. Beautiful, awe-inspiring, and capable of reducing you to component molecules without apparent effort. They were roughly the size of small aircraft, covered in scales that seemed to absorb light, with teeth that could probably cut through titanium, and eyes like molten gold. They sat in perfect formation around the colony, patient as statues, deadly as black holes. "They've been like this for 3 days, General Thexmore explained through the shuttle's communication system. His voice had the slightly hysterical edge of someone who had been staring at a problem that couldn't be solved by superior firepower. No aggressive action, no communication attempts. They just... wait. Elizabeth studied the pack through the shuttle's viewport while the cubs in her arms stirred restlessly, making small sounds that might have been excitement or distress. "How close have you been able to get?" "Our scouts report they allow approach to approximately 500 meters before showing warning postures. Attempts to get closer result in..." The general paused. "Deterrent displays." Translation: "They told you to back off and you did." Our translators couldn't interpret. "General, I'm a veterinarian, not a linguist. But I'm pretty sure that when something with fangs the size of swords shows you its teeth, the translation is universal." Elizabeth adjusted her hold on the cubs, who were becoming increasingly agitated as they approached the pack. "Set us down at that 500-meter mark." "Dr. Martinez, I must protest. General, with all due respect, your military expertise got us into this mess. Maybe we should try some mammalian expertise to get us out." The shuttle touched down on the rocky ground with a thud that suggested the pilot was either nervous or possibly having some kind of medical emergency. Elizabeth stood up, gathering the cubs carefully in her arms, and paused at the shuttle door. "Oh, and General, when I walk out there, do not under any circumstances attempt to provide backup, cover fire, or rescue operations. If this goes wrong, it'll be over before your weapons can charge." "And if it goes right?" Colonel Cathara's voice was tight. Elizabeth grinned. "Then we all learn something new about interspecies communication." She stepped out of the shuttle into the thin air of Kepler, and immediately every single Crimson Maw in the formation turned to look at her. 47 pairs of molten gold eyes focused on the small human carrying 3 small bundles. Elizabeth had faced down rabid dogs, aggressive wild animals, and once, memorably, a very upset rhinoceros with a toothache. But she'd never had quite this much predatory attention focused on her at once. "Okay," she murmured to the cubs, who were now making urgent chirping sounds. "Let's go meet your family." She started walking. The adult Crimson Maw didn't move, but their attention followed her with the intensity of 47 laser targeting systems. Elizabeth kept her pace steady, her breathing calm, and her voice soft as she continued talking to the cubs. At 400 meters, she could see individual scars on the adult's scales. At 300 meters, she could hear the low rumbling sounds they were making. Not growls, she realized, but something more complex. Communication of some kind. At 200 meters, the largest of the adults stood up. Elizabeth stopped. The massive creature was easily twice the size of the others, its scales marked with silver along the edges, its eyes holding an intelligence that was definitely, absolutely not animal-level awareness. This was the pack leader, and it was studying her with the same intensity she usually reserved for particularly interesting X-rays. The cubs in her arms were practically vibrating with excitement now, making sounds that were definitely recognition calls. The largest cub managed to wiggle one paw free and reach toward the approaching adult. Elizabeth took a deep breath and made a decision that would probably either save the day or get her eaten. She knelt down and gently set the cubs on the ground. They immediately rushed forward, chirping and tumbling over each other in their haste to reach the adults. The pack leader lowered its massive head and began making sounds that Elizabeth recognized as the same basic vocalizations she'd been hearing from the cubs, only deeper, more complex. Parent-to-child communication, universal across species. The reunion was, Elizabeth had to admit, pretty touching. The cubs were thoroughly sniffed, nuzzled, and fussed over by what appeared to be the entire pack. She found herself smiling as she watched the smallest cub, the one with the plasma burn, being very gently examined by what was probably its mother. Then the pack leader looked at her. Elizabeth met its gaze steadily, the way she would with any large animal she was trying to communicate with. Non-threatening but not submissive. Respectful but not afraid. The creature approached slowly, each step deliberate and careful. It stopped just outside arm's reach and lowered its massive head until they were at eye level. Elizabeth had been in this situation before, being evaluated by an intelligent animal, being measured for trustworthiness. She stayed still and let it happen. The Crimson Maw leader studied her for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it made a sound, low, rumbling, and unmistakably approving. It was saying thank you. Elizabeth smiled. You're welcome. Behind her, she could hear the frantic communications from the Zephyrian forces. She could also hear what sounded like several people having minor breakdowns. But in front of her, the pack was beginning to move. Not attacking. Not advancing on the colony. Leaving. The adults gathered their cubs with the efficient organization of any family preparing for a long trip. The pack leader looked back at Elizabeth once more, inclined its massive head in what could only be interpreted as a formal farewell, and then led its family away from the colony. In 5 minutes, they were gone, leaving behind only tracks in the dust and a lot of very confused colonists. Elizabeth stood up, brushing dirt off her knees, and turned back toward the shuttle. Through the viewport, she could see General Thexmore, staring at her with an expression that suggested his worldview had just been fundamentally restructured. Her communicator crackled to life. Dr. Martinez, the general's voice was barely controlled. What just happened? I returned some lost children to their parents, Elizabeth said, walking back toward the shuttle. And we all learned that sometimes the simplest solution is also the right one. But how did you know? General, I've been a veterinarian for 15 years. I know the difference between aggression and protective behavior. I know how families work, regardless of species. And I know that most problems can be solved by treating everyone involved with basic respect and common sense. As she climbed back into the shuttle, Elizabeth missed the massive communication burst that was currently spreading across the galaxy. The footage of her walking calmly among the Crimson Maw, of returning their cubs, of successfully negotiating with creatures that had been considered utterly hostile, was being analyzed by every xenobiologist, military strategist, and diplomatic corps in known space. She also missed the emergency session of the Galactic Council that was being called to address what they were referring to as the human protocol. But she definitely didn't miss General Thexmore's final communication to High Command as they lifted off from Kepler. Request immediate meeting with Earth diplomatic representatives. We need to discuss the possibility that we have been doing everything wrong. The Galactic Council chambers were, in Elizabeth's professional opinion, designed by someone who had never met an actual living creature. The space was too large, too echoey, and too full of sharp edges and dramatic lighting. It was the sort of environment that would make any animal nervous, which probably explained why most galactic politics seemed to involve a lot of posturing and aggressive displays. Currently, representatives from 47 different species were engaged in what appeared to be a very civilized version of a territorial dispute over her. The human protocol represents a fundamental shift in interspecies relations, declared the Andromedan ambassador, whose crystalline form chimed musically as she spoke. We must establish formal procedures for its implementation. Implementation? Elizabeth looked up from the datapad where she was reviewing the medical files of the Crimson Maw cubs, which, according to the reports, were doing fine back with their family. I didn't create a protocol. I just gave some lost kids back to their parents. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or invasion fleets. Counselor Velnari of the Hegemony, a 7-foot-tall insectoid with more dignity than seemed structurally possible, leaned forward. Dr. Martinez, your actions at Kepler Colony have resolved a conflict that our military strategists believed would require a fleet. Engagement. Because you were thinking about it wrong, Elizabeth said, with the same tone she used to explain to pet owners why their dogs were eating their shoes. You assumed hostility when the behavior clearly indicated protectiveness. But how could we have known that? This from General Thexmore, who was attending via hologram and looking like he hadn't slept since Kepler. Our xenobiology databases indicated. Your xenobiology databases were written by people who approached everything like a potential threat, Elizabeth interrupted. When you meet every species with weapons drawn, what kind of behavior do you think you're going to see? The Earthling had apparently just committed the diplomatic equivalent of suggesting that the Emperor was, in fact, naked. Representatives began arguing in 17 different languages, their translation software creating a cacophony of indignation, revelation, and what might have been religious awakening. Order! The council president, a methane breather whose environmental suit made her look like a mobile chemistry lab, activated the chamber's sound-dampening field. Dr. Martinez, are you suggesting that our first contact protocols are inadequate? Elizabeth considered this. Well, let's see. Your first contact protocol involves armed ships, weapons displays, and formal challenges to establish dominance hierarchies, right? Murmurs of agreement echoed through the chamber. And how many first contacts have resulted in peaceful, cooperative relationships? The murmurs stopped. Right. Elizabeth stood up, because sitting felt too much like being a specimen in a zoo. Look, I don't know much about galactic politics, but I know about animal behavior. And most of what you call hostile species are just scared, territorial, or protecting something they value. But surely some species are genuinely aggressive, began the Proximan representative. Sure, some are. But you can't tell the difference between genuine aggression and defensive behavior if you approach everything with the assumption that you're going to have to fight. Elizabeth pulled up the Crimson Maw files on her datapad. According to your own records, every single encounter with the Crimson Maw involved military vessels making aggressive approaches to their territory. What did you expect them to do? Invite you to tea? We expected them to respond to diplomatic overtures, General Thexmore said defensively. What diplomatic overtures? Showing up with battleships and demanding access to their breeding grounds isn't diplomacy, it's intimidation. Elizabeth shook her head. Look, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a veterinarian. But I know that if you want to build a relationship with any intelligent creature, you start by demonstrating that you're not a threat. The chamber erupted again, but this time the arguments seemed more thoughtful and less territorial. Elizabeth caught fragments of discussions about revising first contact protocols, establishing new diplomatic procedures, and something that sounded like academic theories being hastily rewritten. Councillor Velnari raised a chitinous appendage for attention. Dr. Martinez, would you be willing to serve as an advisor for a new First Contact Protocol Development Committee? Elizabeth blinked. I'm sorry. What? Your approach to the Crimson Maw situation has demonstrated capabilities that our diplomatic corps currently lacks. We would like you to help us develop new procedures based on your methods. My methods are just basic animal husbandry and common sense. Precisely, said the Andromedan ambassador. Resources we appear to have been neglecting. Elizabeth looked around the chamber at 47 species representatives, all of whom were looking at her with expressions ranging from hope to desperation to what might have been worship. You want me to teach galactic diplomacy, animal psychology. We want you to teach us how to not accidentally start wars when we meet new species, corrected the council president. Elizabeth sat back down. This was either the most ridiculous thing that had ever happened to her, or the most sensible thing the galactic community had done in centuries. Possibly both. Okay, she said finally, but I have conditions. Name them, said Councillor Velnari immediately. First, no more taking children away from their families for research purposes. That's just kidnapping, regardless of the species. Murmurs of agreement, and what sounded like several representatives making notes. Second, first contact teams include someone with behavioral psychology training, not just military and diplomatic personnel. Agreed. Third, if I'm doing this, I'm doing it right. That means proper funding for research, translation resources, and support staff who actually know the difference between territorial display and aggressive intent. Done. Elizabeth looked around the chamber again. And fourth, can we maybe redesign these meeting spaces? Because honestly, this room is designed to make everyone nervous and territorial, which is probably not helping with the whole peaceful diplomacy thing. The silence that followed was broken by what sounded suspiciously like laughter from several species representatives. "Dr. Martinez," the council president said, and there was definitely amusement in her electronically modulated voice. "I believe we have found our new director of interspecies relations." Director of... Wait, what? But Elizabeth's protests were drowned out by the sound of unanimous approval from 47 different species, all of whom had apparently just realized that maybe, just maybe, they had been making things a lot more complicated than they needed to be. 6 months later, Elizabeth sat in her new office, redesigned to be less threatening and more conducive to actual communication, reviewing the latest first contact reports. The success rate had improved by roughly 400%, mainly due to the revolutionary approach of not assuming everyone new was trying to kill them. Her assistant, a young Zephyrian named Kexley, who had apparently decided that studying human behavioral psychology was the career path of the future, knocked on her door. "Director Martinez, we have a situation developing in the Outer Rim. New species, apparently very territorial. Our scouts are reporting hostile postures." Elizabeth looked up from her reports. "How did the scouts approach? Single ship, scientific configuration, standard diplomatic protocols." Define standard diplomatic protocols. They maintained safe distance, transmitted friendship messages, and requested permission to establish communication. Elizabeth smiled. It was amazing what qualified as revolutionary in galactic politics. And the territorial behavior? "They've surrounded our ship with what appears to be their entire population. No aggressive moves, but they won't let us leave." Elizabeth stood up, already reaching for her field kit. "Kexley, have you ever considered that maybe they're not trying to be hostile? Ma'am? Maybe they're just curious, or excited, or maybe, and this is just a thought, they're trying to welcome us, and we're misinterpreting their behavior." As she headed for the door, Elizabeth reflected on how much the galaxy had changed in 6 months. They were still making mistakes, still misunderstanding each other, still occasionally almost starting wars over translation errors. But they were getting better at recognizing when they were being ridiculous. And sometimes, Elizabeth thought as she prepared for another impossible diplomatic situation, that was the best you could hope for from any species. The wisdom to recognize when you were being an idiot, and the willingness to try something different. Even if that something different was just treating everyone else the way you'd want to be treated. Revolutionary concept, apparently. The shuttle ride to the Outer Rim gave Elizabeth plenty of time to review the preliminary reports, which were, predictably, written by people who had apparently never encountered a social species before. "Subject species demonstrates pack behavior," she read aloud to Kexley, who was frantically taking notes on everything she said. "Coordinated movement patterns suggest hive mind or military organization. Recommend extreme caution." "Is that not accurate?" Kexley asked, his writing stylus hovering uncertainly over his datapad. "Kexley, when you were a child, did you and your siblings ever all run to the door when someone visited your family?" "Well, yes, but... And did the visitor assume your family had a hive mind, or did they realize you were excited to meet someone new?" The young Zephyrian's neck frills shifted to what Elizabeth had learned indicated embarrassment. "Point taken, Director." Elizabeth continued reading the report, her expression growing increasingly incredulous. "They've been monitoring our ship for 6 hours without attacking, clearly building up for a coordinated assault." She looked up. Or, and here's a radical thought, maybe they're just being polite. The shuttle's communication system crackled to life. "Director Martinez, this is Captain Torres on the diplomatic vessel Harmony. We have a developing situation here." "Define developing, Captain." "The aliens they've started bringing us things." Elizabeth blinked. "What kind of things?" "Gifts, we think. Local artifacts. Food items. What appears to be artwork. They're leaving them just outside our safe perimeter and then backing away." Elizabeth covered her face with her hands. "Captain, please tell me you haven't been treating gift-giving behavior as a potential threat." "Our security protocols require we treat all unknown objects as potentially dangerous." "Captain, Has it occurred to you that these people might be trying to welcome you with traditional hospitality, and you're sitting there analyzing their housewarming presence for explosive potential? The silence on the communication channel spoke volumes. "Sir," came a new voice, probably the ship's xenobiologist. "Initial scans of the items show no dangerous materials. They appear to be ceremonial offerings." Elizabeth sank back in her shuttle seat. "Let me guess. Your response to their gift-giving was to increase security and maintain defensive positions. Standard protocol requires, Captain, imagine you brought a new neighbor a casserole to welcome them to the neighborhood, and their response was to call the police and have the casserole analyzed for poison. How would you feel?" Another telling silence. "I'm guessing," Elizabeth continued, "that they're probably standing around wondering why the visitors are so rude that they won't even acknowledge hospitality." When they arrived at the Harmony, Elizabeth could see the situation through the observation deck windows. The alien species, tall, graceful beings with iridescent skin and what appeared to be naturally occurring feather-like appendages, had indeed surrounded the ship. But instead of the menacing formation described in the reports, they looked more like an enthusiastic welcome committee. Several of them were holding what were obviously gifts. Others appeared to be performing some kind of dance or ceremony. A few of the younger ones were clearly trying to get closer to the ship, only to be gently restrained by the adults. "They're not surrounding us," Elizabeth said to Captain Torres when she reached the bridge. "They're celebrating. This is a party." "A party? Captain, I'm willing to bet that your ship is the most interesting thing that's happened to these people in decades. They're probably wondering if you're gods or explorers, or just really exotic neighbors. Either way, they're trying to make you feel welcome, and you're treating their hospitality like a military threat." She studied the aliens through the viewport. Their body language was open, curious, excited. Several of them were pointing at the ship with what appeared to be enthusiasm rather than aggression. "How do we respond?" Captain Torres asked. Elizabeth smiled. "We accept their gifts, thank them politely, and maybe see if we can join the party. Radical concept, I know." As she headed for the shuttle bay to make first contact, Elizabeth reflected that perhaps the galaxy's biggest problem wasn't hostile aliens. It was that everyone had forgotten how to be neighborly. But that, she supposed, was a problem veterinary medicine was surprisingly well equipped to solve. After all, most animals were social creatures at heart, even the allegedly civilized ones.